Given what just happened, I think we can pretty much all agree at this point that the United States is just the actual
Fudging.
homelander. The mask is fully off, and they just do not give the smallest, most microscopic of
Fudge.
no more. So now, if the US has gone full homelander, then who the hell is our Billy Butcher? Who's our trenchcoat wearing badass that's supposed to take on Homelander? Looking around the world, there's really only one country that's got the men, money, and machinery to take on America's Homelander. And it ain't Russia. Well, not anymore at least. Obviously, I'm talking about the People's Republic of China. But unfortunately for everyone in the world who isn't an American imperialist meat rider, Xi Jinping is not Billy Butcher. He doesn't own a badass trench coat, and he sure as hell isn't gonna go scorched earth against Trump. In fact, the word that best describes Xi and every other Chinese leader after Mao is autism. Specifically, geopolitical autism.
Autism with Chinese characteristics.
Okay, what do I mean? Well, just look around the world. Is China doing anything to counter the Americans' geopolitical cockslapping? They're not really helping the Russians in Ukraine. They're not helping the Iranians stand up to Israel. And they're still doing nothing to help Venezuela, Cuba, or Colombia, or Greenland, or any of the other sovereign states that the US is threatening with conquest and regime change. All China ever does is issue strongly worded condemnations of the UN Security Council. How many tank divisions and carrier combat groups does the UN have? When has the UN ever done anything to rein in American imperialism? And it's not like China has no leverage to use against the Americans either. The trade war proved that if China really wants to make the Americans squeal, it can. Beijing has that power. It's simply choosing not to use it. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Why the hell doesn't China use its considerable leverage over the US to rein in the worst impulses of American imperialism? Why is it always just strongly worded letters? Why no economic sanctions? Why no punitive tariffs? Why no military aid for those countries actively resisting American bullying? In short, why does China do nothing? Well, the irony is that in the first 30 years of the PRC, China was actually very active in geopolitics. Like the Soviet Union, China got itself involved in every single Cold War proxy fight. Everywhere from Latin America to Southeast Asia to East Africa. Wherever there was a bunch of Marxist guerrillas who needed some guns, China was more than happy to send over some Chinese AKs. That's actually why Chinese AKs are found literally everywhere in the global south. They've been there since the 1960s in most cases. And then, of course, there's the Korean War, and to a lesser extent, the Vietnam War. China sent millions of men to go toe-to-toe against the Americans in Korea. This was in 1950, at a time when the PLA couldn't even manufacture its own machine guns, never mind artillery, tanks, or fighter jets. And yet, Chairman Mao still went all in and ended up winning at least a partial victory, which is why North Korea is not an American colony today like South Korea is. But then, in 1976, Mao died. And when Deng Xiaoping took over, he tried his hand in geopolitics with the 20-day border war with Vietnam. It was intended as a way to divert the Vietnamese army's attention away from Cambodia, a Chinese ally at the time that was being invaded by Vietnam. But because Deng half-assed the whole thing, he failed to save the regime in Cambodia, and Vietnam achieved a humiliating win over China. That one failure caused Deng to basically rage quit geopolitics altogether. His mantra thereafter became, quote-unquote, hide your strength, bide your time. And 40 years later, that is still the mantra of the Chinese leadership. But here's the thing. Back when Deng first came up with the idea in the 1980s, it was arguably the right thing to do at the time. But now is not the 1980s. China is not a backwards agrarian minor power with a GDP of a single Japanese prefecture. In 2026, China is the largest industrial power in the world. It has a huge and modern army, navy, and air force. So the idea of China, quote unquote, hiding its strength is absurd. Geopolitics doesn't work on Skyrim logic. If a country just crouches a little, it doesn't magically go invisible. China isn't going to beat the US with a freaking stealth archer build. That's why I call it autism, because only an autistic person would think that it could still hide its power while it's the freaking 800-pound gorilla in the room. The other aspect of China's autism is its absurdly naive belief that trade can be separated from politics entirely. They believe that they can trade with the entire world while doing politics with no one. This is why Chinese officials keep saying that weird-ass line about how China never interferes in the internal affairs of other countries. They really mean that. China genuinely thinks that the world is just a giant wet market where every vendor is civil and polite and doesn't kidnap other vendors in the middle of the night so they can steal their
stuff.
Chinese folks to this day still can't comprehend why anyone would risk a war to get something that they can obtain through trade. This idea just does not compute for the Chinese, which is why you never see China doing it. What the BBC and CNN call, Chinese neo-colonialism is literally just normal-ass trade. China could just as easily start doing actual colonialism, but they don't, and they never have. Even centuries ago, when China was sailing the largest fleet in human history across Southeast Asia, India, and Africa, it didn't establish a single colony. That idea was never even considered. And that's why I call it geopolitical autism. China is obsessed with trade and thinks that trade is all that matters. Sort of like how some autistic kids are obsessed with trains and think that the world revolves around trains. Actually, come to think of it, China is also kind of obsessed with trains. Dear God, we really are like a whole-ass country on the spectrum, just trade maxing and train enjoying all day long. I mean, there really is no other way to explain China's inability to grasp the basics of geopolitics, is there? I mean, it's not cowardice or an inherent fear of the United States. Remember back in April of last year when Trump announced his absolutely insane Liberation Day tariffs on the entire world? Half the world just folded immediately, bent themselves over, dropped their panties, and let Trump have his way with them, all natural. The only country that didn't drop panties was China. Yeah, China and only China had the cojones to dick slap the Americans right back in the face with their own tariffs and force the Americans to give in and settle for a fair trade deal. So if it's not cowardice, then is it just that China isn't strong enough to counter the American military? Well, believe it or not, it ain't that either. And you don't need to take my word for it. The Pentagon itself admitted in a leaked report that China's drone and missile arsenal would be devastating for the US Navy, which is why Trump has gone real quiet on Taiwan since he got back in office. So if China were to pass around those drones and missiles to all of its friends and fans, then I think that the Americans will have a much harder time gallivanting around the world, kidnapping heads of state in the middle of the night. We actually saw a little sneak peek of this when the Americans tried and failed to defeat the Houthis in Red Sea. The Houthis were armed with some Iranian copies of older Chinese anti-ship missiles, as well as drones made with all Chinese parts. And even with these like Temu versions of Chinese military hardware, the Houthis were able to force the American Navy to quit the Red Sea and basically give up trying to break the blockade. I mean, it was humiliating for the Americans to lose to yet another Islamic militia. So just imagine what a real-ass country like Iran or even Venezuela could do if China were to sell them the best weapons that China has to offer. Rather than J-10s shooting down Rafales, we might see J-35s shooting down F-35s. And wouldn't that be
Fudging.
awesome? Hell, if China were more like Russia or Cuba, then it would send its own men to defend Maduro. We know now that many of Maduro's bodyguards were Cubans. The US might not hesitate to shoot at Cubans, but I think you'll have to think real hard before shooting at Chinese soldiers. That shit could start World War III. So the last bit of copium that Wu Maos pull out when they're confronted with the issue of China doing nothing is the idea that China doesn't need to do anything. I mean, what does it matter for China if Maduro gets kidnapped or the Ayatollah gets toppled? China, as they say, just needs to focus on itself. Well, to that idea, I really have no words to say that won't get me demonetized for all of eternity on YouTube. China, quote unquote, focusing on itself is how China got itself into the freaking century of humiliation. Not taking part in geopolitics, not being proactive in its own defense, not caring what other great powers are doing around the world. That was how the Qing Empire found itself on the wrong side of white people imperialism. China is a big country, but it ain't bigger than the rest of the world. If China just sits there and lets the Americans consolidate their control over the rest of the world, then China is going to find itself in a very lonely place. Countries like Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba didn't turn against the US because of anything that China did, but they will fall to the Americans because of things that China didn't do. What's worse is that going forward, no one is going to risk taking China's side against the Americans. Just look at what's happening right now in Latin America. None of the countries there that are friendly towards China dare to mouth off against Trump now that he's gone full homelander. Countries like Colombia, Brazil, Chile, and even Mexico are going to stay the fuck away from China going forward. They know that if they side with China, the Chinese won't do shit to help them against the Americans. So it doesn't matter what kind of economic incentives China has to offer. No country will choose trade over survival. And that's precisely the choice that they face when dealing with China versus the US. So yeah, if it's not cowardice and it's not weakness and it's not a lack of incentive, then why doesn't China do anything? Well, the only answer left is autism. China is literally just on the spectrum. It still thinks that it can hide its strength and bide its time when it's literally the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And the US is speedrunning imperial decline. If there were ever a time for China to stop hiding its power and actually seize the moment, then now is it. And yet, China is showing absolutely no sign of doing any of that. It's still singularly focused on trade, even as the US gobbles up its best trade partners. It still has this 1990s mentality of just chilling and letting the Americans run the whole show. That's why I call it autism. China can see and sense the world around it like anyone else, but it can't interact with it like a normal superpower would. Anyway, that's enough of me ranting today. I fully understand that what I said is upsetting for many of my target audiences, but that's just the way I am. I have to keep it real. And unlike most Wu Maos and partisan hacks, I'm not afraid to swallow my L's. Maybe one day, China will be blessed by another Chairman Mao figure, someone who has the cojones to play butcher to America's homelander. But today is not that day. Today, China is still on the spectrum. Anyway, if you're still here, then it means that you're either too busy to switch to another video, or you actually enjoyed what I had to say. If it's the latter, then I'd appreciate a like and a sub. Going forward, I will do my best to put out at least a few videos a month. I'm sure that 2026 will produce no shortage of things for me to talk about. Until then, remember to keep it real and stay away from the copium pipe. Peace.